This is History 8, and we have to talk about history of ideas today, which is very powerful, very difficult. It's difficult to hear, so I would like to make a contrast for you. What is operative in history is the person, our person, the who that we are. And the who that we are has an objectivity. Our person really exists. It's quite objective. When I was a boy, people still talked about human character. Character in my lifetime has disappeared until it's something almost a laughable kind of concept. In Buckaroo Banzai, across the eighth dimension, the alien chieftain says, character is what you do in the dark. It's a pun on the deconstruction of the objectiveness of the human person. Character isn't something that's done in the dark. It's done by the light of your consciousness, not so much your conscious intention, but your conscious decision. And it's the conscious person who is the effective actor in the historical process. But maintaining this point, this position, this objectivity to our person is very difficult. If we take a look some 500 years ago at the style of the way in which certainty of character, objectivity of person was established and maintained, we get something like this. This is from St. Teresa of Avila, back in the 1500s. And she writes this: "O my Lord, how abundantly you display your power. There is no need to seek reasons for your will, for you transcend all natural reason and make all things possible. Thus you show us what we need to do, no more than truly love you and truly forsake everything for you, and that you, my Lord, will then make everything easy." Here the saying is apposite, that you pretend to make your law difficult. Apposite means that it's opposite, but not in a polarity opposite. It means it's a diagonal opposite. She was very learned. In logic, in medieval, high medieval registry, there were always four positions. There was something and its obverse. There was the thing and its reverse. And both the obverse and the reverse are polarities. But there is a fourth position diagonally, which is the contrapositive, which is the reverse of obverse, or the obverse of reverse. That diagonal relationality is apposite, APP. So that reverse and obverse are apposite and contrapositive and character. The thing itself, the statement, the assertion, and its contrapositive are opposites. So she's saying here that there's a very curious thing, that human beings in the world think that God's law is very difficult, whereas it's the opposite, not the opposite, but the opposite to that. It's difficult only when we ourselves are difficult about it. When we cease to be difficult about it, God's law is very easy. So this was about 500 years ago. 200 years ago, we have Benjamin Franklin. This is from his autobiography, and this is his own account of his way of working with history, his way of establishing his character, his way of being a conscious person. We saw St. Teresa in her refinement of keeping an apposition of actuality current in her life, following, to the best of one's ability, God's laws. Here's Benjamin Franklin. This is different. This is after 300 years of concerted historical development, really packed. He writes, "It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took the advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. I concluded at length that the mere speculative conviction that it was our interest to be completely virtuous was not sufficient to prevent our slipping, and that the contrary habits must be broken and good ones acquired and established before we can have any dependence on a steady, uniform rectitude of conduct. For this purpose, I therefore contrived the following model." And he makes for us a whole series in his autobiography of the little charts that he would keep on 14 separate virtues. And he would keep them by the day, because he worked by the week as a unit. And the 14 virtues and the 7 days of the week were put into a matrix. And Franklin, each day, for the entirety of a week, would keep track of the distribution of his attention equally on all 14 points. And after a while, he got used to the fact that by keeping this ritual matrix in his attention constantly, so that he had an equal distribution over 14 points for each day of a week, and then week after week, that he built into himself a quality of dependable response. And he said later in his life that this was to him a sign that God was indeed real, because he had been blessed with the capacity to learn how to learn this, and that was indeed following God's law in his way. So it's not so much that Teresa and Franklin are different, they're different expressions. And it isn't because they just lived 300 years ago. It isn't just because one is a woman and one is a man. They both are versions of the same kind of attentiveness. Because if you read in St. Teresa, her autobiography, or any of her wonderful works, you see that she learned to distribute her attention just like Franklin did. But her matrix simply had different items in it. But she also followed a weekly schedule. The Sabbath, for someone like a mystic of Teresa, was always the punctuation of the rhythm of time. The week has always been a sacred structure of time. And so even though Franklin rarely could stand to go to a church of any kind, simply because he was so intelligent and experienced and practical, that he found that most people giving sermons were just chucking out speculative advice off the cuff, when what he wanted was something very detailed, specific, and practical. But both Teresa and Franklin learned to have some kind of a matrix of ritual comportment which they could learn and inculcate and get used to, which then not so much displaced bad habits, but reformed the formation of habitness, so that instead of ritual comportment sinking into a chaos of habitual reaction, all of that energy and all that objectiveness achieved a form which was then some kind of a grid which allowed them to compute a direction, a navigational direction, which was the movement of their own lives. So that the mystic Teresa and the enlightened Franklin share a technique which we are also beginning to be conscious that it's incumbent upon us to do this, to find for ourselves some way to make a basis to our actions, what we do, which distributes the attention, distributes the quality of awareness to the level of consciousness, so that what we do occurs to us in a memorable sort of a way. If you do not have some kind of a matrix of keeping track, you quickly lose track and you do not have an accurate memory of what has happened, of what has occurred. The sports fanatic constantly checks the figures. What's the batting average? How many of this? How many of that? Yes, here's the batting average. What's the on-base percentage? The whole statistical array of professional sports is a way of remembering. It's like a mnemonic ordering. Now, the primitive form of this memory aid by ritual disposition of attention, so that the distribution is even across the entire field of what you're keeping track of. The initial primitive way of understanding that is the old focus and place, the eggshell grid. The Latin designation of this in Cicero is loci et foci, location and place. And indeed, memory, or a form of it, can be trained if you have this kind of egg crate grid, this kind of Benjamin Franklin quality of laying it out graphically, and you can do that. If you have a mathematics class in high school now, where you want to trace the geometry of something, establish the angle, establish the area of a sphere, some kind of geometricity, you always work with a set of coordinates, the x and y axis. Or if you're working with advanced geometry beyond plane geometry into trigonometry, you have 3 coordinates, x, y, and z. All of this is a very primitive way of constructing memory from the standpoint of natural integration. But there's another type of memory. The type of memory which functions in history is not that of nature. The process of nature being extremely fluid, not statically at all what one would expect, always a matrix of change. So that nature is a process, constantly changing, nevertheless allows its energies and its motions to be distributed into ritual grids of loci et foci. nature in its process, in its way of having a quality of energy, allows that energy to be distributed so that human beings for tens of thousands of years, if not for hundreds of thousands of years, have understood that one way to get along with nature is to set up a ritual comportment vis-a-vis the functions of life. And that if you keep that ordered, life has its health to the point of even delight and charm. The whole idea of sleeping for a regular period of time, of eating in regular periods of time. The whole idea, even back we saw in the early part of this course last year, that the courageous Jane Goodall, who observed the life habits of chimpanzees, who as an evolved form have been around for 70 million years, that they found that there's a distribution by gender of the way in which the structure of the pact, of the chimpanzee family, extended family structure, maintains itself. That the female chimpanzees always occupy the centering quality of the geographical area where they ritually live and ritually feed. And that the males of the chimpanzees always are pushing out to, but never beyond, the boundaries of that hunting terrain. They patrol the boundaries, the females hold the centers. But she found that while the males cannot go into some other chimpanzee territory, because there are males from that territory patrolling those boundaries, and that this is a sure fight. But that in all cases, female chimpanzees are free to go from one terrain to another. They can go from one ground, one family structure to another. They're welcome to come in anywhere. And they always have a place at that center, so that all centers of chimpanzee territoriality are to the female's home. Whereas all boundaries are to the male chimpanzees perilous, iffy thresholds. All of this is to say that life on this particular planet, and expectedly on any planet in any star system, has a ritual comportment which tunes itself to the nature that is operative there and finds a way of maintaining itself by structure, by forms, so that the fluid process of nature has its energy distributed into a form by the ritual actions. And by that, how the rituals are set up, by the cycle of a moon, by the cycle of a sun, on whatever basis you cite it up, that form holds and accepts and distributes the energies of nature in such a way as to permit a good, dependable basis of life. And that all of this holds as long as one remains within the cycle of nature. As long as we're within the cycle of nature and have founded our ritual comportment in some reasonable way, respecting that nature, respecting that energy, respecting the distribution of that energy into a form, and as nature's energy comes into that form becomes vivified and real. In an abstract way, doing dances with feathers and bells shouldn't mean anything. It should simply be superstition. And to consciousness, it certainly is superstition. But as long as one is within the natural ecology, that happens to work. It happens to actually occur. And it occurs in spectacular ways that one could hardly believe if you were left to simply the criteria of rational consciousness. I remember reading one time an account of a Navajo medicine man who my friend Manly Hall had known in the 1930s. A medicine man who was very famous in the Navajo Nation. His name was Hustine Kla. And in his old age, he was driven around by the wife of the trading post owner, Frances Newcomb, who was a very elegant East Coast lady who had married this man who ran this trading post on the Navajo Nation's reserve. And she recounted that she was driving him along this highway near the Monument Valley area of the reserve, when the sky, which had been lowering and darkening with clouds, suddenly sent out this whirlwind that just hit into the desert and started churning up, and then somehow found the road and came straight down the road towards their car. And she stopped the car. She was absolutely petrified because she realized that the storm was in this rut and was coming exactly for them. She was alone in the car with Hustine Kla. And as she writes it, he calmly got out of the car and walked towards this tornado. And on the way, he picked some leaves of a plant that the Navajos call ethel. You've seen the little pink blossoms all over this kind of rosemary-type herbal plant. And he chewed this in his mouth as he continued towards us. And when he had masticated this to a certain point, he stopped and he spit at the tornado. And she said the tornado split into two. One part whirled up into the cloud and disappeared, and the other part whirled off the highway and lost energy in a spurt of dust that went off to the side. And he just simply, in a matter-of-fact way, came back to the car, closed the door, and was again the old man ready to be chauffeured to someplace on the reservation. We don't understand, we don't believe, we don't know the tremendous efficacy that men and women for millions of years understood in many variations of species on this planet. That when our ritual comportment is energized by nature, it's nature's own energy that gives those forms viability. They're not made up, they are real. They are what we call existence. That existence is not positive of nature, but positive of the energy of nature coming into the forms which our activities make. That's what's existent. And so existence has this tenacity, this base of reality, which is truly objective. It's the first cut of what is real in any dimension of anything. And we saw how this builds, that objectivity of our ritual comportment, the action of our bodies, builds a kind of a base which flames into language. That language for us seems to be the flames of the energy, perhaps exuding nature's own energy out of the things, so that names of something are not abstractions that are labels that are pasted onto something, but the sound of the words is the vibration of the energy of the thing. And all this is on the mythic level, has nothing to do with anything else. No other levels are necessary. So that language as a vibration, as a process in itself, is parallel to nature. We've saw this many, many times. And that a good, healthy language of a realistic population of men and women has a certain vibrancy to it where it has an interplay with nature. And what such human beings say really is on the level that it's natural and that the energies of nature, like the juice of nature coming into the forms of what they do, gives vitality and gives life. And that there's this camaraderie where the animals and the plants and the people and the rocks and all the things form a family, are a family, are in fact a family. It's not a sociological designation. That's simply a description of what really happens. One can still, in our time, go to places where men and women are still in a family with the plants and animals and nature and rocks and get that feeling tone. And when one gets it, it comes across as an equilibrium. It's not that life is peaceful, but that it's real. Its equilibria is in terms of the health of a process, of a phase-form cycle. But the final phase of that we saw is precarious, because language tends to have its own objective quality. Just as nature's process yields the existence of bodies, language's process yields the existence of minds. And languages as a process have an energy, and the energies of language come into and distribute the mind's forms, the mind's structure. So that words literally are the juice that comes out of experience that vivifies the mind. And this is the realm of symbols. And we've seen this. We've talked about this. The whole first year it was about this cycle: nature, ritual, myth, symbol. And that they fit together. They're like the 4 quarters of the world. They're like the 4 C's of wholeness. The Chinese always talk about the 4 C's. Even though they knew more than 4 C's, they meant this kind of squareness, this quarterliness, this quaternity, this frame of reference which whirled round for all time has a vitality to it because it's the shape of the ecology of what actually occurs, of what happens, and we can live there. We do live there. But like any frame of reference, when the frame is completed, one then has a realm which is ready for a picture. Once you have the frame, the most natural response there is in reality is for a picture to go there. And what comes into the picture is not a part of the frame anymore, but is the center. It's the interiorization of that frame of reference. And so when the ecology of nature is finished, it's like something supernatural comes, a supernatural picture. We call it vision. In very ancient times, they called it magic. They didn't know what else to call it. What it meant was that in the frame of the double objectivity of body and mind and the double process of nature and language, in that completed frame came something that was different, that was other. It was in some mysterious way related to nature and its ecology, but it seemed to be like a summation. Not just a summation in terms of adding it up, but a transformation, that it took the frame of reference of the ecology of nature and transformed it out of the frame into the picture, so that one saw, and that one's seeingness per se was freed from having to stay in the frame. So that vision became a supernatural, boundless ability to see from within out. Instead of natural seeing, it was like a supernatural seeing. That one saw, and one saw in such a way that it was unbounded. It was frameless. And men and women, in whatever languages they needed, said of this that this is spiritual. It's of the Spirit. And since it definitely is related to nature, but is not in the natural ecology, which finds its completeness in the objectivity of the mind, it must come as a gift. So that vision was always considered a gift of God. And this quality of vision changed forever as soon as one has this visionary capacity, as soon as consciousness, we call vision today consciousness. As soon as consciousness is there, its nature as a process is to transform. That's what it does. Wherever consciousness sends its quality of intensity, and its quality of intensity, rather than being like energy, is sort of the complement, the underside to energy. We get the term energy from the Greek. That's how our term came, energeia. And in the Greek, the complement to energeia was always dynamis. And just as we pronounce energeia energy, we pronounce dynamis dynamic. And so we say of consciousness that it has a dynamic. Vision has a dynamic. Now, when people were speaking English and they didn't remember the old Greek and they used dynamic, they stopped using dynamic after a while and they used the English term which stood for it, which was force, or sometimes power. So by our time, consciousness came to denote power. Power and force. And that this power and force changed things. That's what power is for, is to change things. To force it to be different. To get to make things different. And so by slow and not so slow degrees of misunderstanding and miseducation and ignorance, it comes to historical times of recent centuries where the whole idea now is that human consciousness was given to us to change everything in the way in which we want it to be. Whereas it's a subtle and not so subtle misunderstanding completely. And only a really comprehensive education reinstates the sensitivity and sensibility necessary to keep track of how all this works together. But as if it weren't enough that there is a fifth phase, a quintessential mysterious quality like consciousness that comes into play, consciousness as a process, vision as a process, has its own objectivity, the person. So as the body comes out of nature, as the mind comes out of language, the person comes out of conscious vision. And yet there's another process. There's a fourth process. It's almost like the archetype of stability is that fours work. The old wisdom statement is that 4 is not 4. 4 is a pair of pairs. That a square is not just 4 lines, but it's also 4 angles. So that the stability and the structure has something to do with pairedness at its root. And when a pair of pairs is brought together, one gets an ultimate stability. One can count on that. But to the extent that either of the pairs is out of tune, the entire structure becomes wobbly right away. So that the key concern of someone looking for the health of reality looks to the atomic unit of pairedness and makes sure that there's an equanimity in the pairedness. Because the instabilities on huge levels are small. In terms of cosmic time or nanoseconds, is always that there's an imbalance. There's a non-equanimity in the pairedness of the whole structure of what is going on. We say in our time that when a pair is perfectly matched, that structure is a tuning fork. And that you can tune, let's say, an instrument like a piano with a set of tuning forks so that each string has its own tuning fork, and with a set of tuning forks, a set of 8 so that one has this octave, you can tune a piano so that that piano not only makes sounds in a ritual comportment geometric order like a matrix, which an octave is for sound. The piano has 88 keys so that you have 11 octaves on the board. And with that large a distribution of sound within the ritual comportment of such a thing as a scale, the octave, one can learn to play such an instrument in such a way that conscious compositions of artistic form that would never have occurred in nature are not only possible but happen every day, thousands of times on this planet. There are people playing pianos, making music sometime to the extent of playing like Bach's French suites, which when you see somebody play that on piano, it's like the biggest magic in the world. No magician has the deftness of movement of their hands as a concert pianist playing a Bach French suite on a piano. That's big magic. It's unbelievable. And one experiences that musical form, that Bach French suite, maybe even played on a harpsichord by some old lady like Wanda Landowski, can touch you in such a way that your entire body and mind are restructured by the listening of that music structure, of that Bach composition. And little Wanda Landowski can transform an entire salon room into people who are tuned together to that music, that musical form. She's as great a magician as has ever lived at that moment. She's the true inheritor of the prehistoric shaman who first learned that consciousness can reach back through the whole ecology of nature and transform and reshape the mind, the experience, the body, and nature also. Even plants that have heard music like that are different from the plants that didn't. And as we become more refined, we will learn that even the rocks in the foundations of the concert hall heard and were renewed. Let's take a break. Let's come back, and let's come back to a telling issue. The issue is history, which is a process that faces us like a 50-foot wave facing a surfer. It has so much energy in it that you're not going to be able to deal with it unless you deal with it in its terms. And one of the most curious things is that the process of history has not energy so much, but it has dynamic. The way that we keep track of it is by a paired quality of conceiving. It's like any energy, normal, ordinary energy that occurs within a spectrum that we now know and call, and have called for a long time, the electromagnetic spectrum. Notice that that has a pair of names, electromagnetic. It means that the energy of your radio, the energy of light, the energy of X-rays, whatever it is, that electromagnetic spectrum, that the energy has a very large component of electrical amplitude and a very small component of magnetism. So that the crisscross of electrical and magnetic energy make electromagnetism. And there's a mathematical language worked out about 140 years ago by a Scotsman, which talks about how that electromagnetic energy will behave under any conditions whatsoever. And Maxwell's field equations work very well. But as we've mentioned before, they happen to solve in a negative way just as well as a positive way. But that in Victorian Scotland, you didn't talk about negative realities. This is still a holdover of who knows what kind of demonic stuff. So they talked about the positive solutions. And you had electromagnetism. But when you get into the 20th century and you deal with subnuclear particles, when you deal with astrophysical cosmoses, it becomes apparent that indeed there is an energy form which is magnetoelectric, which has a large magnetic component and a small electrical component, and behaves in a very rational, regular, mathematical way. Only that the matter in a universe of magnetoelectric energy has a much more vivified existence in terms of measurable energy, about 10 billion times. So that if I were made out of the matter from a magnetoelectric universe, I could walk through this electromagnetic universe like a phantom and never leave a trace. The space in between atomic particles, electrons, and nucleuses within any atomic structure is so vast. According to Buckaroo Banzai, the matter that makes up an atom is 1/quadrillionth of its volume. The rest is all space. History is not quite magnetoelectric so much as it is of a different mode from nature. Nature's mode is always integration. Nature always likes, she loves to personify her for a moment. Mother Nature loves for things to be. She likes for atoms to happen. She likes for molecules to get together, and if they can work, great. You take this atom of oxygen and these two little atoms of hydrogen, and you put them together for a molecule of water, H2O. It's very stable. Stable, it turns out, not only anywhere in the universe, but also in interstellar space. There are molecules of water, not many, but they're still there. So that nature likes integration. So that the whole integral cycle is the natural ecology. Whereas the complement to it, not the polarity, not the inverse, but the complementarity, the opposite quality to it, its complementarity is differentiation. And the two processes of nature and language, which are integral, are complemented by two differential processes, which are consciousness and history, or vision and history. What makes consciousness so difficult for someone who's trying to be natural all the time is that consciousness is supernatural or supranatural. Or if you're fearful, it's unnatural. But consciousness tunes itself to history just like language tunes itself to nature. Myth, when myth is whole and really healthy, when the mythology of a people is really whole and healthy, it plays with nature in natural ways. Nature responds, like the tornado responding to Hostine Claw's spittle, because he knew how to make those language forms that were in tune with nature to the extent that he could make symbols in his mind that were as real as the objective tornado on the highway. Claw was not only one of the great medicine men, but he left behind, and I hope they're still there, for Manly Hall, 36 drawings with colored pencils that normally he would have made into these huge rugs, Navajo rugs that have the symbols of the mythology completely intact. They're not works of art, they're works of symbolism. And that the symbols, like Claude drew 36 large, old, gray, cardboard-backed drawings with colored pencils of the complete cycle of esoteric Navajo mythology. In case they've been sold or thrown away, I've kept a photographic record of them so that they'll at least be there. It's a great example of the way in which the symbolic sequence has a real relationality from the mind's thought forms or ideas all the way back and touches and contacts and works with and not only makes nature a part of it, but consciousness working back through those symbols can transform nature by way of those symbols. When Einstein writes E equals mc squared on the board, those are symbols. Symbols from his mind. But you can take those symbols, if you're a Robert Oppenheimer, and have a crew of brilliant people, in Los Alamos, and you can make nuclear energy out of those symbols. A nuclear energy that never would have occurred at that spot in nature. Yes, it is the same energy that occurs in stars in nature, but not there on that spot of the New Mexico desert. How is it that mathematical symbols become real like that? Because this process, this complementation, actually is real, actually happens. So that one has to have a very large, comprehensive concept called the real. And that within the real, there is a square ecology of a cycle of nature, which for all intents and purposes is what reality is for us. But that when we grow enough, when we evolve enough, when we come to the point of being conscious enough, the integral square ecology of nature is complemented by a differential square ecology of, I suppose we could just call it consciousness. But like that square of nature, that frame of reference of nature has its integrity with nature, ritual, myth, and symbol. The differential square, the differential frame of reference, has its integrity with vision, with art, with history, and with science. And the operative energies in the one, in integration, are nature and language, whereas the operative processes in differential modes of reality are vision and history. You have to work with them if you're going to get anything done. It's like they present themselves like some kind of post-apocalyptic Mad Max, and they say, you want to get something done, you got to come to us. We're the ones who can drive the truck. In this world, in the differential world, we're the ones who drive the truck. Nature can't drive, and myth can't drive. It's not that they're wrong. It's not that they're no longer necessary. It's that in this situation, they can't drive. They certainly get to ride along. They have to be invited. They have to be always a part of the family, that's for sure. But they cannot drive. And what happens is that vision, which is the initial driver, gets to a point to where it can't drive either. And consciousness, conscious vision, which is the last word and beyond the last word, in supernatural capacity, finds itself reluctant, just like the ego was reluctant to let go of the old mythological types. The spiritual person has to learn to not let consciousness unchaperoned drive in a historical situation. Why? Because visionary consciousness is not objective. It's a process. And it cannot parade itself, it cannot pretend that it is objective, because it isn't. It's a crucial illusion to think that consciousness is a thing. Not at all. So it isn't that it can't drive because it doesn't know how to drive or is a bad driver. It's that structurally it can't sit in the seat and find the steering wheel and do anything. So what does it do? How does this illusion happen? What does it do? It pretends by going back to the objectivity of the mind. Only when it goes back in a pretend mode. So consciousness now is acting. And when it comes back in this regressive pretend mode, the mind, which naturally has been superseded by vision, has given birth to this vision, finds itself intruded upon, inhabited by a power that's much stronger than itself. And when regressive consciousness comes back to the mind, it says, well, this is not going to do, because see, it's differential energy. In fact, not an energy, but a dynamic. And a differential dynamic doesn't waste time at all with the niceties of integration. Its mode of operating is differentiation. It likes to analyze, to break down. And so differential consciousness comes into the mind and says, analytically, we got to grind all this up. What is all this stuff? These are rituals. These are myths. These are symbols. We have to do a little house cleaning here. And so analytical consciousness in its regressive form goes in and recuts and reshapes everything. And out of this, you get what we call an ideology. Not an idea, which is natural to the mind on level of symbols, but an ideology, which is an illusion, which analytical consciousness, by its own unintentional functioning, forces to come into play. But because the mind is so powerful, and especially if it's drunk with conscious infusion, goes to work to reform not only the mind and its ideas and its symbols, but looks at experience and says, you're still living by myths. Hey, the challenge is something out here called history, and you're living by myths? And so it starts to analytically dismantle the whole healthful structure of experience according to its lights. And what suffers most in this, the mind is very quick and somehow survives this onslaught, believes on the deepest level that this pretense can't go on forever, and when the time comes, it'll regain. People who are in a regressive delusion at the deepest level still have this kind of confidence that they'll right things, and that's because in a universal, realistic, ultimate way, they will. It may take 1,000,000 lifetimes, but they will. So technically, they're well placed not to be ultimately worried. But what gets ultimately worried is the body, because the body doesn't handle this regressive kind of ideological imposition, this analytical restructuring into an ideological mind that then demythologizes experience. And that immediately registers in the body, and the body responds by twitches, tumors, who knows. Because all of this is not in the natural ecology at all. It's not for integration. It's for nitpicking apart the very structures that are now not considered primordial but primitive. The ideological mind says these bodies have got to be completely redone. This population of people are all wrong. We want you to be this way, not that way. You're still prizing fresh water and fresh air over progress. These trees, which you're having your nice little campfires under, are in the way of a high rise. They got to all come down. And so this imposition comes like some kind of negative tidal wave. rolling through. But what it doesn't touch at all is the mysterious openness of nature. Because Mother Nature is not objectively there to register like a body. And also is not some secondary process like language, which even though it's tuned to nature, nevertheless is not primordial. But nature is. Nature's mysteriousness is very primordial. And Mother Nature doesn't accept this at all. And in her non-acceptance of a negative, it makes a positive. Two negatives make a positive. And her non-acceptance takes the form of, I suppose we could call it a kind of a paradoxical sweet revenge. She still does her thing, which is to emphasize that existence is what is important. Existence is what is real, and not these ideologies. So Mother Nature responds to an ideological regressive onslaught by upping the energy. She just sends more energy. And if the ideological regression proceeds with more and more force, well, you can see that the tension becomes higher and higher. This is sometimes called the war in heaven. It means that this warring condition, this tension of complementarities that have been perverted into false opposites, creates a situation, all of it starting from a misdirection of the person vis-a-vis history. Now one says, well, in tribal times, were there not these kinds of wars? Yeah, tribes are supposed to fight all the time, right? It's like even that old film 2001 that begins with the chimpanzees. Didn't they fight? Jane Goodall, didn't she find that chimpanzees fight? They make war? They do not make war on ideological grounds. They fight from the ritual comportment of territoriality, which is not an ideology. That's a whole different thing. An ideology is a differential, high dynamic form which has for its amperage, not just for its frequency, and energy doesn't just have a frequency, but it has an amplitude. And its amplitude, when it comes into play, in this kind of attention where the frame of reference, the square of attention, as we talked about, becomes strained. Because the strain doesn't register in some kind of comic book metaphysical Akashic level. It registers exactly in the frame of attention, the square of attention. And that's where you get the caving in, the damage, the actual injury on one of these sides, on one of these corners. Like in a mythological level, two of the most important of all of the mythological images in every mythology are the mother and the father. You can have an injured mother image. You can have an injured father image in the mythology because of some kind of analytical, differential, regressive, ideological reconstruction that just simply steamrollered and happened to damage that particular image there. So what happens to the mythological child? Becomes orphan, becomes an orphan, becomes casualty. Who knows? And this is just the beginnings of a whole ratcheting series of confusion that proliferates. Why does it proliferate? It proliferates because the dynamic that's coming into play is differential. It isn't that problems are just bad, it's that they get worse. A problem is not a problem because it's bad, it's a problem because it will always get worse. That whole process of problem becomes problem making and multiplies. It's its nature. Good demons, in order to be demons, have to demonize. And one can be abstract about it. One can be meditatively calm about it and assess that and understand that, but when it comes into play in human lives, it's torrentially crushing, difficult, and upsetting, and it is. And it isn't that someone is imagining. That whole process of imagination we saw is one of the qualities that's there in the mythic level. That language has an imagery at all is due to this functioning of imagination. But consciousness doesn't use imagination, it uses memory. It uses a mnemonic order. And if it's in a regressive form, it will take a regressive mnemonic energy, put it through an ideological prism, and force the imagination to come up with the proper images. Or you will face the firing line. Or whatever. And so one is tyrannized, one is terrorized into submission to a situation that, quote, has no basis whatsoever in one's experience. Now, you look for a solution. Any place there in the natural ecology, you can't find any traction. The confidence is that somehow, because the first objective quality that seems to be impaired is the mind. Well, I haven't been thinking right. I'm feeling weird. So-and-so, mind is not quite right. Well, in that natural ecology, isn't the mind the completion of the whole thing? Must be the most powerful thing there. So the confidence is somehow that if the mind can be put back into order, then you'll be okay. It's the assumption of psychoanalysis. It's riddled with problematics. And it's also rife with downright errors. The cure rate for any psychoanalytic therapy is exactly 50%, which is chance. You flip a coin. But there is a curative, permanent, therapeutic, which works. And it works because it takes the situation in its own terms, in its own dynamic. It differentially interfaces so that instead of looking for an answer to a problem, which is an integral misstatement of the whole thing, it isn't that there's a problem. That's not the situation at all. There is no problem. It's a whole field of problematic that's in operation, and that's what needs to be addressed. So the compulsion to find an answer to a problem is a puppet response that fits and dovetails neatly into the whole ideological scam which is being foisted on the situation in the first place. Aldous Huxley's psychotherapist was named Hubert Benoit, and when Benoit was analyzing Aldous Huxley in Paris, Huxley was such an intelligent, brilliant character that in the analysis, Benoit discovered that he was not an analyst. He discovered that Huxley was not crazy. He was not neurotic. He didn't have a psychological problem. That he was facing a realistic situation which his therapeutic training and everything was not equipped to really appreciate, much less cure, much less handle. So Benoit quit being a psychotherapist and became a Zen practitioner. He wrote a book called, Alan Watts' favorite book was The Supreme Doctrine. The supreme doctrine is that there's no doctrine. And he wrote a little book that followed it called Let Go. And the topic sentence of the first paragraph is, the most neurotic thing in human life is to look for an answer to a supposed problem. Because the truth is, there is no answer because there's no problem in the first place. That entire ensemble is a knot in and of itself. And as long as you keep tugging at any one of those strings, the knot will seem to stay there. That the strategy is, don't tug at any of those strings because they're irrelevant. The whole knot is irrelevant. It's an irrelevancy. The saying in the mid-60s in Berkeley was, as long as you fight against authorities, they have you. To maintain their authority, they need to have you fight. How else are they going to convince all this money to be spent? How else will the absurdity of having 50 caliber machine guns on every corner of a little campus community is justified? Why? Because they have stones in their blue jeans? That the whole resolution is not an answer problem tension at all. That entire scenario is an illusion. It has nothing to do with what is real here. Whereas men and women can readily learn to deal with what is real because that's really what we do best. We function in complete reality best. We do have wings, but the wings are not wings of a body, but they're wings of an insight, of a differential insight, which our spirit really has. And when the problems of history are addressed by spiritually winged men and women, they find a way to navigate through whatever storm is there. They've done it many times. They can do it now, and they always will find a way. But it takes a little bit of cooperation, not in an integral mode, but in a differential gestalt. They have to learn to work together in differential gestalts, where populations are consciously, relationally working together, but they don't have to have some kind of doctrine which unifies them, because that plays right into the form of an ideological regressive inculcation. Because there are many levels of these problems, and on the deepest level, civilization itself is something needing a cure. Edward Carpenter, friend of Walt Whitman's around the turn of the century, wrote a book, Civilization, Its Cause and Its Cure. It's this quality of insight, though. The insight is not to mistake the phase that is operative for some kind of supposed public understanding, common sense, nor to suppose that some kind of skewed learning has taught us the wisdom of tradition that these are the choices of solution and we have to find one. that usually works down to some kind of a paired false choice. The paired false choice in terms of historical problems is that of political parties. Your choice is liberal or conservative, Democratic or Republican, this or that. Whereas the whole notion of political partyness is an ideological form that is regressively superimposed upon the mind, the experience, the actions, the nature of an ecology which in its own right doesn't have any traces of that whatsoever. That those forms, in fact, are not sent from beyond the natural ecology back into cinch things together in a way in which this or that doctrine, this or that platform says it should be. Now, this is a very great difficulty. No people are more sensitive to this. No people were more brutalized than the German population during the Second World War. And right after the Second World War, in 1946, one of the most perspicacious philosophic minds in Germany, Karl Jaspers, wrote a book called The Origin and Goal of History, trying at a time when the crisis was so fresh that it just simply was a nightmare every day. Not because he was a victim, but because he was the opposite. He was the executioner. He was on the side of executioner. Not that Jaspers was in the Nazi Party at all. Not at all. He protested and wrote monographs. But the experience that Jaspers shows here when he writes, the political concept of liberty becomes external and inverted if it does not retain its foundations in the meaning of liberty, which must be considered the authentic being and doing of man. Let us essay a philosophical exposition of the nature of freedom. And then he goes into this exposition, and I don't want to belabor it. We don't need to have something here which is complex, but a couple of these topic sentences leap out. But absolute truth, and with it final freedom, is never attained. Truth, together with freedom, is on the way. We are not living in the eternity of the perfect concord of souls, but in the time of the ever uncompleted imperative of change. He writes also, hence the content of freedom is manifested through life in polarities and antitheses, which are always pairs. Polarity is a pair which tends analogously to work together, like positive and negative in electricity. Even though they're polarized, positive and negative, they work together to produce electricity. Whereas antitheses work against each other and they negate. So those two pairs, when brought together, polarities and antitheses, they produce absolute limbo. If they were perfectly matched, nothing would happen. In other words, the ideal of solving a polarity by bringing something antithetical into play with it is that one neuters the situation. And that's not very good for life. A neuter answer to a life problem is a very unsatisfactory solution. This is the solution of the pretend yogi. who brings a short-circuiting, antithetical abstractness to a life polarity problem and shorts it out and says, well, we're successful. Successful? Yeah, we're not bothered by it anymore. Oh. Oh. You're right. Oh. It's extraneous. It's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with reality. It's a made-up strategy in terms of problem answer on very high abstract symbolic level, and very high abstract symbolic level is below the basement level of consciousness, conscious vision. You don't even bother with that kind of level of misunderstanding in terms of conscious vision. When you're dealing with a problem in history, one has to understand that history is a part of a square of attention. That's where this education really has its geometric guts. You can lay it out for yourself in a way where you can begin to have, like Benjamin Franklin with his diagrams, or St. Teresa with her mystical, meditative prayer confidence, that there is a way to work this out. And one of the tried and true fashions that men and women have enjoyed for long, long millennia is there is a way to balance the ritual comportment by distributing the natural energy into a limited spread of things that count, of counters, of elements. And though there may be more, and though this list may not be complete, this is enough to get you going, get you started. You can modify it later by adding or subtracting, by condensing or expanding. And if you're neurotic enough, upset enough to where there's only one thing that you can count, that's fine. You can begin there. Because it turns out there's a mathematical technique pioneered by a man named Gauss, as a matter of fact, a mathematical technique of taking one factor at a time and running that particular factor through the confused array. And by taking that one factor out, one reduces the order of the complexity of the confusion by that amount. And you can repeat that process by taking a second factor and consistently ordering and removing that from the confusion. And this application eventually will reduce an unknown confusion down to a manageable size in a remarkably limited series of applications. In fact, it turns out to be an ace tool in computers because it's the whole basis, it's the whole intellectual comportment that makes algorithmic progressions work. And it turns out that one of the most beautiful, pragmatic uses of intelligent consciousness is to fit in an algorithmic improvement into any process that one does. So that literally you even have machines that are self-correcting as they work. And so they work better and better. True, they will probably never be perfect, but they get to be very good within the limited function that they need to function. And you can put something like a Mars probe down within less than 100 feet of where it's supposed to be, some 70 million miles away. That when you started the rocket that carries that probe so many months before, that particular loci et foci in the universe didn't have any planet there. Mars was way over in some other part of its orbit. But it was going to be there, exactly there, And even though it's 4,200 miles in diameter, that particular loci at Foci was going to be at this spot of that planetary sphere at that particular time. What time is it in a star system anyway? It certainly isn't Saturday morning in the universe. So you have to have a way of getting time, space, and consciousness coordinated to such a way that one can be exactly realistic to an nth degree within, say, one algorithmic application of perfection, and do that prescriptively. Well, the fact that we can do that means that historical problems are very much within the range of our solution if we're intelligent about it. I remember reading, I think I was about 12 years old, I read an editorial in a science fiction magazine called Astounding. The editor was John W. Campbell, Jr. Late, maybe I was only about 10 years old. Late 51, 52, early 52. The Korean War was still going on. I remember reading this editorial where he said, we have the technological capacity to put a base on the moon, but we in no way have the political sagacity to maintain it. And I remember thinking, so that's what's going on here. That's why none of these adventures. Because we don't know how to handle ourselves in a universal form yet. And yet we have the capacity to go and be universally. And the question I think that I asked semi-consciously was, what in the hell is going on? What have adults been doing all these thousands of years? They've been trying to address an amorphous mess with fictitious little darts that don't do anything. Why? Because ultimately of poor education. The problem finally is not because there isn't the right doctrine. No doctrine is right. It's that nobody learned to deal with what's what in a way that's effective. It's as simple, it's as complex, it's as dumbfounding, it's as profound as that. And that's why there's education. We're shifting to a new pair of texts next week. Hegel, Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, and Jacob Burckhardt on the Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. Try and get some copies of those. The Hegel is a little bit difficult to find, but any of his writings on history, you can find paperbacks. Reason in History, Lectures on Philosophy of History, whatever, just to get the flavor. Hegel is someone who comes right after Benjamin Franklin. Hegel is a contemporary of Jefferson. Hegel was one of those geniuses in the Germany of that time who realized that their tribal warrior-like capacities didn't do them any good vis-a-vis history. That it didn't matter how much armor you had and how good of a knight you were, that it didn't do anything at all to the challenge of history. And so Hegel set himself to this particular problem. What's going on here? What kind of dragon are we facing? And Burckhardt is the complement to that. He comes about 2 generations later. He's like a grandchild to Hegel's generation. He comes at a time when the realization was, oh my God, history has a structure. And that its structure is in these vast eras. And that one of the most profound eras in the last couple thousand years was the rediscovery of something called, and the rediscovery was called a rebirth, And the word for the rebirth is renaissance. That it was a rebirth, a renaissance of the apex of classical antiquity. That there was some relationship of the Italy of the 1500 period with the Italy of the 0 AD era. That they were linked together. Burckhardt would never have been able to see that linking without the foundations of Hegel's thought. Not that Burckhardt was a Hegelian, but that he lived in a milieu where the mind learned to differentiate in these terms, on this scale, in this kind of energy form, and came to see, indeed, there are objective shapes. And the question that both Hegel and Burckhardt asked in their respective inns of the 19th century was an inquiry which the 20th century has tried to find an answer to, and is just now at the end of the 20th century realizing that there's no answer, but rather there's a field of resolution. So the 21st century will be a century of no longer stumbling to try to find answers, but will be a roll up the sleeves time of getting ready and engendering the field of resolution so it can happen. The question that the 19th century asked was, in all this, what's the cosmos doing? Next week.